This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Mapper Forward's first on-demand workshop, How to Become a Coffee Consultant. Available now online for you to learn at your own pace with a certificate available upon completion. Click the link in the show notes to access today for just €50. Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Mapper Forward, friends. I'm your host, Lee Safar, and this is episode 2 of our 5-part series with Simon, and we're talking about acquiring coffee knowledge. And the reason we're exploring this is because when I started in the industry and when Simon started in the industry, there was not a lot of structure around the way that knowledge was acquired. And I would argue that there's still not, despite the fact that we have education platforms and things like that, there's still no real way of deciding what knowledge is actually correct and incorrect. So leaning into that, we want to talk about the different kinds of knowledge that there are. And today, Simon, we want to talk about subjective knowledge versus objective knowledge. Now, you recently wrote an article that we're going to include links in the show notes for. And this was a really fun article around your coffee competition that you recently did. So do you want to start by explaining what the whole preface of that was, and then we can lean into your explanation around that?
You're referring about the one on water chemistry, is that right?
Yeah.
Just checking. So I recently competed in the Australian Brewers Cup Championship. I came fourth, very happy with the results. And the topic that I spoke about was water chemistry, but I sort of made it incredibly simple and incredibly easy to understand for people with a lot of the analogies. Mm-hmm. And I did write an article on the back of that. But basically, the way I tackled it was I wanted to tackle this complex topic with easy to understand metaphors. And because when I got into water chemistry, basically, I have a basic background in chemistry, basically a high school major. So I understand the basics of dilutions, concentrations, molar mass. So basically, most of what you need in a coffee context, you don't need much more than that. But I did do a lot of reading, read a lot of books, and I found it incredibly confusing. And I did find a lot of the information out there wasn't practical, and none of that. And I spent a lot of time researching on that topic, and none of that was helping me make better coffee. So I decided to tackle it, from a more let's say, straightforward, a more practical point of view, more pragmatic way. Mm-hmm. And the analogy that I was making was an analogy between seasoning and irons and cooking and coffee, where basically when you have water, you have stuff that are dissolved into water, and they're basically ions. But these ions in solid forms cannot be found by themselves. They have to be bound with another ion, which basically makes a molecule. So when people say, I'm adding magnesium in my water, I'm adding calcium, it's impossible to just add calcium or add magnesium. It has to come with another negatively charged ion. So calcium usually comes with chloride or comes with sulfates, but then chloride and sulfates is very different. So looking at it this way and separating individual ions means that you need to take these two into account when profiling your coffee, when building your water. And the challenge here with water is that a lot of people are only looking at one specific ion. And if you look at it from a scientific point of view, you don't really care about chloride, you don't really care about sulfate, because they don't count into the general hardness or the carbonate hardness. So I don't want to get too technical, because I could talk about this for hours. But my point was, when you look at it from a very scientific point of view with things that are objectively true, it's not really helping anyone, and no one's really making progress. And there hasn't been a lot of progress and innovation in that topic and in years in coffee specifically. But I think shifting the approach and looking at it in a different angle will lead people to understand it better. And then I think hopefully will drive more innovation in the future.
So what you're talking about there is some really objective approach to understanding what's happening with the water. You've done experiments, you were challenged by some scientists who disagreed with you. You were able to say, hey, you should try this. Here's some evidence. They did go and try it, and they went, oh, wow, oops, you're right.
Might have missed something. Yeah.
Right. So that's objective knowledge. Talk to us about subjective knowledge.
So I think just to step back for 1 second, I think there are things that are objective in coffee, and there are things that are subjective. And I often have this conversation with people that aren't necessarily in coffee, that are outside of the industry, and say, well, coffee competition, that sounds very subjective. That sounds like, how can you judge coffee? It's
Yeah.
the same as judging art or judging music. It's how do you objectively judge it? It's very subjective. And that's kind of true to a certain extent. But I do believe that there's a lot of things that are objective in coffee. I think when we're describing a coffee, you give the same coffee to hundreds of professionals who've gone through a specific calibration. Of course, like, the calibration will sort of like create a mold for everyone to agree on the same things. But I do think that people can describe the coffee in the same way, and they can describe the same descriptors. And if you give that to curators, you'll give you the same, like, a score that's in the same ballpark for a given coffee. So people can be objective, and there's a lot of things that are objective. What is very subjective is preferences, and that goes back to.
Can I just stop you there? I got to challenge you on that, because I have a real problem with this idea that when you get a whole group of people together, and because they're calibrated, that they are somehow being objective. I guess when you have people who are subjective and agree with each other, we're kind of assuming that that's objective because they all agree with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that that's fair to kind of...
No, that you've got a good point. I mean, everyone's being subjective, but because they're all subjective and agreeing on the same thing, does that become objective? That's a very good point. I think when you look at it, what makes it subjective in the first place is attributing specific points to specific qualities and criteria. So, for example, vinegar-like acidity, acetic acidity, that's something that's going to be very polarizing. Some people are going to enjoy this in small amounts, and some people are just going to go, nope, I hate that. That's defective in coffee. Acetic acid shouldn't be in coffee. So you'll sort of see differences and gaps in scoring and in assessment for these coffees. Who is to judge that acetic acidity is worse than malic acidity or citric acidity, other types of type of fruit acidity? So this is where there's a little bit of subjectivity. To tackle this specific topic, a couple of years ago, I actually released something called the flavor pyramid, where I ranked all of my favorite flavors in coffee from tier 1, so top favorite flavors, to the ones that I liked the least, tier 5. And I was interested in seeing if other people around the world had similar views, and if I was the only one to like tropical fruits and red fruits in coffee, or if people had different views on that. So I sent these surveys to hundreds of people around the world. I had, I think, 650 people joining the survey and ranking from 1 to 10 about 50 different flavors commonly found in coffee. And the interesting thing is that some flavors are, very desired by a lot of people, which makes them, I guess, objectively better than other flavors. And some other flavors did seem very polarizing, where you had a variance of standard deviation that was quite high. So, for example, chocolate is polarizing. Some people like it, some people won't like it in coffee. Alcoholic flavors are polarizing. Some people love it and some people didn't like it. Tomato was another one of them. So there are flavors that always did well, regardless of who was scoring it, and there's flavors that never did well, and there's flavors that were a little bit more polarizing. Yeah, so I guess when you look at pineapple, mango, and strawberry flavors in coffee, a lot of people seem to really enjoy these ones, which I guess brings a sense of sweetness, acidity, and just like this intense aromatic flavor. So in that sense, there is a sense of objectivity, because a lot of people would agree on what is good, and then
perhaps I can say that.
But I think it's a deeper, more philosophical topic, and I guess we could discuss that for a long time.
Well, and it brings into things, if we're going to have this conversation, we have the conversation, right? Like it brings into things of the cultural palette of all the judges. Is there diversity there? Is there, how much diversity exists in that group? What's the difference between the genders and all of that? So that, we don't want to call something like that objective because so many things can influence the outcome of it, which is to me, quite subjective. But
no, I do see your point, and I think most people would agree. I would agree with you. I'm usually challenging this, thinking that you can get to a level where there are heaps of coffees that I don't like personally, but I would, I guess, try to be as objective as possible, and I could see why other people would like them for their intricate qualities. And I think there's a few people that manage to do that very well as well. So in that sense, you can sort of train to become as objective as possible and to sort of like try to put your personal bias aside as much as possible. But again, we're humans, we're not robots, so it's really challenging to do that. So to go back to the subjective aspect in coffee is, well, preferences are subjective, and what is true based on preferences will change with time and place. And you did mention this this example of ristrettos used to be the correct way of making coffee, this sort of like very acidic, intense style of espresso. And then we moved to, so ristrettos are usually like 1 to 1.3 something ratios. And then we went to super long shots that were like 1 to 3 ratios. And now we're sort of going back to like 1 to 2, 1 to 2.2. So you have trends in coffee. And what was true 20 years ago might not be true today, and it probably won't be true tomorrow, because the preferences, the types of coffees that we have, what we're looking for in coffee changes. But what does remain objective in that assessment is that the ristrettos are, have a heavier body, they have more acidity, they have less sweetness, and they just have more intensity. There are stronger coffees. All these things are true and they're objective, but the subjectivity is in terms of what do people prefer and what is the right, correct way of serving coffee. But there are elements to that are objective, and there are elements that are subjective, and there are elements that are still true, and there are elements that are not true. So what is still true about ristrettos is the fact that, they're incredibly acidic and heavy-bodied, and they're very intense. So that hasn't changed, and it's still true today, and it will still be true tomorrow because of fundamental, extraction and extraction principles. So I think when you look at knowledge and from that angle, there are things that are true and they are objectively true, and they will hold truth for a long period of time, which is usually the sensory aspect, the sensory description of coffee. Then, what is correct to be serving in a cafe, that's completely subjective, and that will change with time.
100%.
And the explanations of why things happen in a specific way, I do find that they are, they are presented as objective because they're presented as evidence. Why does a ristretto have a higher amount of acidity? And you will read scientific papers explaining that the acids in coffee are more soluble, so they come in the first part of the extraction. But there has been like contradictory evidence, not on that specific topic, but usually when you try to explain the why things happen in a certain way, this is when we're getting at a much deeper level, and sometimes we just don't understand these things, and we sort of like come to certain conclusions that might not be true. So I would much more focus on the what happens in the cup and what that does, rather than try to go and understand the why. So there are elements of objectivity and subjectivity in all things. But what I do find to be almost always true is the sensory aspect. If I roast coffee darker, how does it taste? Yes, if I keep pushing the roast, it's going to taste a bit more bitter. We're going to lose some acidity to a certain extent. We're going to gain in body. All these things are practically true, with obviously all the caveats and intricacies of roasting and roasting dark. It's not like a binary system of light and dark. It's a bit more complex than that, way more complex than that. But there are still things that were true 100 years ago, and they will be true in the future. And that's usually everything around the sensory.
Well, and it's like when you go to when you taste the coffee of a particular roaster, and somebody says, "Oh, their coffee's good because it's a dark roast." This is the epitome of subjective knowledge. Anyone who likes a dark roast is going to agree with you. People who like a light roast are absolutely not going to agree with you. But the more objective side of that is whether that's a well-roasted dark coffee, or if it's dark because someone's burnt the shit out of it when they were roasting it. There's that side of it.
Yeah, that is quite subjective because I mean, again, there's two sides. There's two sides to that.
Yeah.
What I think is objective and what is subjective. The objective side, for example, roasting is it within a specific like actron sort of like roast degree color, and if it's above a certain threshold, yes, we can objectively consider that this falls into the dark category. But for someone who's used to Nordic style coffees, very light roasted coffees, I mean, I have a lot of friends in Europe that think that Austrian roasters roast incredibly dark in general. I'm like,
wow, that's so not the right.
wow, that's that. I never thought so, but
From their
compared to what
perspective,
you
it
see,
is.
yeah, from their perspective, it is. So this is, and from my perspective, it might not be dark. So it depends on your point of view, it depends on your standard and your reference points. But if we were to sort of take a full wide range of what coffee can be like in terms of roasting, not removing all of the defective roasting on both ends and anything that's extreme, then this is when you can have a scale that's maybe a little bit more objective, but again, it depends on your point of view and it also depends on your preferences. And usually when you have people making comments like, oh, this is too light or this is too dark, it also has a sort of like, it's sort of linked to their personal preferences.
Yeah, which leads us to, again, subjective thinking.
Right? Yeah. So again, to me, preferences are always going to be subjective because we all are we're looking for different things and we have different preferences. So naturally, coffee as a product will have this subjective element where some people like specific coffees and other people don't like these coffees. But there are things that are objectively true. Like my dad and I drink very different coffees. I drink fruity, acidic coffees, and he loves bold, full-bodied, low-acid coffees. But we can both agree that specific coffees have these attributes and characteristics.
Yeah, right.
And what he thinks is good is different from what I think is good. But that's because of personal preferences. But the sensory aspect is to me very objective.
Yeah, beautiful. One subject we didn't touch on, we will cover in a future episode in this series about infused coffees when we talk about trends and the way that the industry follows those. But in the next episode, folks, we're going to talk about accessibility to knowledge. So join us in the next episode. Peace, love, and peanut butter. Have an amazing rest of your day. Thanks for tuning in, friends. There are 2 ways you can support this podcast. Firstly, become a paid member of our YouTube channel. Secondly, you can join our Patreon for as little as $3 a month. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video before you leave and check the show notes for more information. Now, this is what you should check out next.